It's like my web, so
Well, that's fucking annoying.
no matter.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. I'm actually, holy shit. Yeah, finally. It's because I turned on authentication. But it never gave me an option to like type in my fucking username and password. So I have no idea what the fuck happened. Here, I just got
Right.
Oh, not. Oh my god. Forever Dirt. Okay, get rid of all the fucking timestamps and shit. Public, use politics. No, it's not made for kids. And I think
Not made for kids.
not made for kids. Well, I would imagine. Well, like I talking about fascism and all the weird political shenanigans we've been getting ourselves into probably isn't a kids thing, but I always put not made for kids.
Fascism for kids.
Yeah, you gotta get them young, you know.
Hitler Youth.
Okay, I think so.
All right.
We're live. At the very least on my end, I got my video going and shit. And I think we're actually good to go. We're actually going now. So anybody watching, there's nobody watching right now, but if anybody does end up watching this part, yeah, we had a lot of fucking trouble getting Discord to just do its thing. So, but we're here now. Anyway, yeah, I'm talking. Yeah.
Yay.
I'm clearly talking with Forever Dirt, another YouTuber. Yeah, along the lines of like political stuff and whatnot. Yeah, tell me more about yourself. Because I scanned your videos a little bit. I did watch the fascism one. I watched I think the first like 20 minutes or so while I was waiting for Zero Gold. And yeah, it's well I would definitely like to know more of your thoughts on that. But
yeah, well, I have a YouTube channel where I mostly talk about Marilyn Manson and fascism, I guess. That's kind of where I've pigeonholed myself. But I'm very interested in politics, and I'm mostly interested in the sort of meta conversation about how we engage in politics, how we conduct discourse. That's really where my interest lies. And fascism proved to be an interesting topic for that because as many people have pointed out, including George Orwell, everybody is a fascist to some person. He noted that he heard people from every different corner of politics get labeled fascists, to the point where the term kind of loses any meaning. And so that's where I started to get interested in it. I started to think, well, what actually are we talking about when we talk about fascism? Because the way it's generally discussed, it's basically that fascism means anything that we don't like. And so fascism is the great boogeyman. Fascism is the great enemy, no matter who you are in what part of the political spectrum. But what's interesting, what interested me is that I found in studying fascism, there was quite a lot in there that I could relate to. There was quite a lot in there that interested me genuinely as philosophy. And so I started to explore it more from a sympathetic angle of trying to understand it the way a fascist would understand their own ideology. And I came to some interesting conclusions. And so that recent video I made about fascism, why I admire fascism, is really the culmination of that journey of me kind of accepting the fact that I do have some things in common with fascism. There are other things I don't have in common with them. But wanting to then explore and open up that dialogue around the subject.
Okay. So yeah, I would a couple things on that. First off, I definitely agree. The majority of the time that someone calls somebody else a fascist, they're literally just using it as a like, it's a way to say that's a bad person, right? It's kind of meaningless overall,
yes.
Or at least it's lost its original meaning. I can definitely see where you're coming from. And I would also say that given the opportunity, most people would probably like go towards some sort of fascist, like ways of doing things, right? Like, I mean, if you could have total power, like, or do things in a way where you are very, like, there's very little in your way. I could see a lot of people jumping on that. well, I guess I should explain what I think when I hear the word like fascist. I typically think of so like a fascist nation is one that's very authoritarian. That's usually run by just one guy, a dictator, and that typically there's like no sort of like well, obviously authoritarian dictatorship, like no sort of democracy there, and it. Oh God, sorry, my brain just blinked after that. So yeah, I guess here I'll start. I'll start with that. That's fine. Just an authoritarian state with a dictator
Okay.
at the helm. Like that's usually what I think of when I think like fascist. So like,
Yeah, and really, the essence of fascism comes down to the idea of the state as the kind of supreme body of society and the thing around which everything in society coagulates. And so you're very right that fascism is probably the most essentially authoritarian political ideology there is. And I would say it's probably also maybe not the most essentially collectivist ideology, but one of the most essentially collectivist
yeah,
ideologies out there
collectivist is
because
this
it
is.
conceives.
Oh, sorry, I was just
Yeah,
gonna say the collectivist aspect. That's an interesting way to put it, especially since well, I feel like there's a lot of talk about like the individual when it comes to like fascist speech, but there's not really. Now that I think about it, sorry, go keep going, keep going.
hmm, right. Well, the whole conception of society under fascism is that society is not a collection of individuals, but rather a whole. The nation is a unified whole in which every individual is basically a cell playing a part in this big macro organism structure.
Okay.
And so, really, all life in fascism is centered around the central concept of the state. And that is what the philosopher of fascism, Giovanni Gentile, meant when he called fascism totalitarian. He didn't invent the word totalitarian, but he adopted it. It was originally invented by critics of authoritarianism, and it means basically what it means generally today in modern parlance. But when Gentile looked at that word, he said, yes, fascism is totalitarian, and that it is a totalizing of all of the forces of life in the nation with the state. And so the state is identified entirely with the nation and vice versa. They don't exist without each other.
Okay, yeah, that is definitely a bit different from how I usually feel, but yeah, I guess yeah, that makes sense. It's the most like well, it's the most because you could say that every nation functions like that to an extent, right? But there like most nations allow for a little bit more like individual freedom. Whereas yeah, in a like fascist state, it's more like everything you do is for the good of the nation. So yeah, I can see where you come from with that. So like, what would you say like the positive aspects then are the ones that you said you can relate to?
Right. So I like the fascist conception of duty. And this is something that I was able to trace back to Giuseppe Mazzini, who was pretty much the founder of the nation of Italy. He was the leader of the organization Young Italy, which spearheaded the movement to unite Italy into one country. And he was not a right winger. He was more of a socialist, but he was a Republican who he was skeptical of the idea of the rights of man as expressed in the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and all that, the liberal tradition, because he felt that focusing only on what we are owed as individuals then kind of warps our perspective. And so he wanted to move people into thinking more, orienting their minds toward understanding their duty to the rest of society as foremost. And that's something that fascism carried to the extreme. And I think that is a really remarkable and important and not often enough stressed aspect of political philosophy. The idea of an individual's duty to the rest of society. And I think it's a very wholesome thing, and it can backfire in some negative ways. But to me, that is a core essential idea that fascism, I think, understood that a lot of the more kind of individualist philosophies of the third estate, as I call them, kind of the liberal French Revolution socialist stuff, don't stress enough to my liking.
Okay, so I think that's where I start to run into like some disagreements with you. So I would say the whole reason we have like we work together to cooperate as a society to like try to maximize our own good to an extent, right? And in order to participate in that society, we have to give up certain freedoms. But like fascism's like kind of like what you were saying. It's like the extreme extent of that, where you almost give up like all of yourself in order for the greater good to be, or in order to pursue the greater good with the nation. I think at that point, it's not really worth it as an individual to participate in that society. Can you kind of see where I'm coming from?
I can totally see where you're coming from. And I would agree that fascism has in the past been far too cavalier about the question of individual liberty. And in fact, this is a criticism that even fascist leaders have offered. Specifically, the leader I'm talking about is Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists. And this is a clip that I actually used in that video of mine. It's him on firing line with William F. Buckley saying the basic error of fascism was the disregard for liberty. In the drive for action at all costs, it overrode individual liberty. And so he was saying this in the 1970s, that the great challenge of our time is to learn how to synthesize the drive for action, which was an important part of fascism that drove him into fascism, with the preservation of individual liberty. So I would agree that fascism has been too cavalier about disregarding the liberty of the individual. And I think it would be best if we are to kind of maybe bring a slightly more fascistic value back into society, into politics in the 21st century, to never lose sight of that, and to then understand the liberty of the individual as important for maintaining the overall health of the collective.
So I would argue, as society stands, we've more or less, at least once again, just my opinion, we've more or less settled on a really nice balance between individual freedom and like what you owe to the nation. Like essentially just like paying your taxes and like being good to the like strangers on the street and stuff. Like I don't know how much more, and I guess like during really fucked times, like obviously if we get into another world war, there's going to have to be some sort of like, there'll probably have to be some sort of draft or something like that. Those are certain things. Like I don't know if, outside of like helping to maintain like what we've built through like taxes and like protecting our country if we have to. I'm not sure how much else I would agree that like the individual owes the nation, I guess, if that makes sense. It's just like I feel like we should try to maximize that like the ability to like go for those freedoms, or like the ability to be free while like trying to like I get people to help out as much as it seems like they need to. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think a lot of it is psychological, and a lot of it is kind of assumed inherited values that we have. And so in this country, we have a strong tradition of people being anti-government, no matter where you look. It seems that people are always very skeptical of state power in whichever direction they are, and they can have very wildly contradictory conclusions based on this. But virtually nobody is repping the idea of authoritarian government and of the power of the state. Virtually nobody kind of fetishizes that idea in our society, and it's very very common to hear people kind of conflate liberty with goodness, and freedom, if it's more free, then it's more gooder. And I think that to a certain extent, I think that's healthy. But I also think that it encourages us to kind of think in a way where we're not looking at what we can do for the rest of the world, and we're looking at what the rest of the world is threatening to take away from us, what the rest of the world is threatening to do to us. And there's this kind of closed off, fortified attitude that comes about from that. And I think it would be healthy for us to be able to open up a little bit and to be able to. Yes, go on. Interrupt me.
I'm sorry. It's just on that. What's like, instead of us focusing on what's good for the world, focusing you're saying that through like fascism we could do that more. We could focus on the good of humanity overall. As far as I'm concerned, it seems like fascism has always been a really, really nationalistic sort of ideology that like strictly focuses on their people and their nation at the expense of like everybody. Is that?
Yes, you're very right about that. And that's one way that fascism differs from Mazzini's thought, because he wanted to extend the goodwill beyond the nation into the whole world. The fascists more or less stopped right at the nation. And I kind of, have mixed thoughts on the whole question of nationalism versus internationalism. But I will say that I am rather sympathetic to the nationalist position, only in that nationalism, what it says is that we can only help the people we can help. We can only really do what we can do with the powers that we're granted in the border that we are assigned. And so trying to organize an international community to cooperate together is a very noble goal, and I do support that. But I think that nationalism kind of recognizes the limits of international cooperation, and it says there's only so much you can do with all these competing interests trying to compromise between them. And at the end of the day, you kind of have to take care of your own people.
But yeah, and I would agree. I would also argue that the nation's working in their own best interests most of the time, especially since our economies are all super interconnected nowadays. It seems like when a country's acting in its own good, it typically benefits everybody else. Not always, of course. There are like wars and like people like screwing each other over, like when it comes to like market stuff. But like it seems like overall, it's kind of like I'm trying to think of a specific thing that's just not coming to mind at the moment. It's almost that idea of, oh my God, you know BioShock, right? You know that video game?
I am aware of it, but I've never played it.
Okay, so there's the guy that founded that like underwater city or whatever. He was like a full-on like a libertarian, right? Like no government, every man should just like essentially. His argument was if every man pulls his side of the chain, focuses on what benefits him, and if everybody's doing that, then overall the nation will prosper. That was sort of like the idea. I guess that's sort of the idea I'm trying to go for. It seems like,
yes.
Yeah, when nations are working in their own best interest, it seems to be good overall for the world. At least like how things work nowadays, it seems to be that way. So I was curious when it comes to I guess in what ways do you think it would be beneficial for, like, let's say America to be more of a fascist nation?
Well, one thing about me is that I am a proponent, or I sympathize, I guess, with what Thomas Sowell calls the do something approach to economics. And so I like the idea of the government getting really hands-on with the economy and experimenting with approaches to try to alleviate some of the ills that are created by just the problems inherent with the market. And that is a huge part of some forms of fascism, specifically the area of fascism. Yes.
on that, well, it seems like most nations, or at least like most capitalist nations, like we've discovered through time that like letting the market just do its own thing just doesn't seem to work well for a lot of people. So the government typically steps in a lot of cases. That's why I'm actually going to talk to some sort of teacher, I think. And I said that I'm for like highly regulated, like capitalist sort of like economy. Apparently that was interesting to him. But anyways, like I would say that's already like a feature. Like that's not necessarily like a fascist feature, at least not in my mind. Like we can do that with like a more democratic, or I guess republic sort of like governmental setup. You know what I mean?
Yes, and you're right about that. But I do think that we are kind of limited in our ability to act decisively and quickly for the economy, and I think that we're limited in our ability to act quickly and decisively in all respects due to the slow and difficult process of democracy, of representative democracy. And I am in favor of democracy, but I do wonder if there are ways we can maybe streamline the system so that we can elect governments that actually have the power to act more decisively. And that might not always be a good thing. Sometimes the man of action, if you Mosley actually used a very good metaphor. If you have like some big heavy pallet that needs to be pulled, you can strap it to an ox and the ox can pull it. But you got to be careful that the ox doesn't go crazy and fucking everything up. And so that's kind of the problem with the idea of the man of action. And that's kind of the problem with the idea of an authoritarian government, the government that has the freedom to act without getting checked. And so I do think there's a balance that needs to be struck. And I am not entirely, I'm not entirely certain what the right approach is for how we should set up government and how we should treat government. But I do think that these ideas are worth considering and bringing back into the conversation.
Well, just to touch on the like, how fast can our government act? First off, as far as I understand, having a slow government is almost like a feature, because if you're making a ton of quick changes all at once, it can really fuck things up, like really bad. Or you could just like swing from one extreme to the other without like any sort of checks at all. And secondly, when it comes to like really fast, like quick decision making, that's why the president has like, certain powers that he can do like unilaterally, right? Like when it comes to executive orders, or like I'm pretty sure he can send the military to wherever the fuck he wants without informing Congress for like 30 days, stuff like that. Like that's why we have that one man in the Oval Office, right? It's so that when the time comes for quick decisions, there is somebody that can make those quick decisions without having to go through a gigantic process, right? So I would argue we already have like, I would say we have a nice balance between like, so it's like when it comes to Congress, it being somewhat difficult and slow, but that helps keep us on an even keel. But then having somebody that can like push the big red button when bad things start to happen, right? Like, does that make sense?
Yes, it makes perfect sense. And I think that the system that we already have is quite remarkable in a lot of ways. And I really do appreciate the fact that we have a system like this, as opposed to many other countries in the world that have much more dysfunctional governments. And so I think overall, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at our country versus all the other countries, and where we came from and where we're heading, we're generally on the right track. But I do also think that there are, valid concerns that the fascists brought up, and they had valid motivations in pursuing what they were pursuing at the time, and specifically in regards to Mosley and the British Union of Fascists. They had a lot of urgent problems that they wanted to address. And it was very difficult for them to get anything done at that time with that kind of government, that kind of zeitgeist that they had in politics. And so I definitely I sympathize, I think, with both sides. I sympathize with where you're coming from. I also sympathize with where they were coming from.
So I'm trying to. Here's an interesting question. Do you consider Trump to be a little bit more on the fascist side of things?
Definitely, I think that Trump
Oh, by the way, I'm listening. I'm just I don't like
is
vaping on stream, so I'm gonna turn off my camera when I do. I just think it's tacky when I do it, but I'm listening whenever I turn off my camera. I'm listening still, just so yeah.
okay. Okay. Yeah, I definitely think that Trump has a more fascistic quality to the overall phenomenon of his fan base and his form of politics. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Trump is a fascist, because I think there's a lot that he doesn't have in common with fascism, just on a fundamental level.
Well, I would say the fact that
And
he's not a dictator
I think
yet.
more often than not.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, I think more often than not, when people talk about Trump in relation to fascism, what they're pointing out is that Trump electrifies a certain kind of anti-democratic urge in a far-right sector of the Republican voting base. And that definitely is a fascistic quality. But I don't think that Trump really philosophically has anything in common with fascism. And I think that his sort of anti-democratic qualities are more just out of convenience than anything else, out of self-aggrandizement than anything else.
Well, but it's still like a problem. I would say it's not just far right people in the Republican Party. At least, I mean, he got elected, so like a lot of people had to have been backing him, and it seems like he still has a huge amount of support, even after January 6th, which is mind blowing. But so when I look at Trump, it makes me it makes me just not want to fuck with fascism, like, ever. It seems to like hardcore radicalize people. Well, and also another like attribute of fascism I didn't bring up. Well, it's because it's just coming to mind. Well, I guess I'll pose it as a question. Do you think that all like fascism, like fascism, has to incorporate some sort of like, this is the ideal citizen, and we need to like strive to make this kind of like, maybe not as extreme as the Nazis went, but like something down that same path?
Yes, I think fascism always pushes for an ideal of the citizen as a microcosm of the state. And so the citizen is supposed to embody certain virtues that the state also embodies. But what those virtues are specifically is up to the specific fascist movement or government to decide on.
So I have a huge problem with that sort of mentality. It seems like whenever you're trying to whittle down like people into like this perfect form, it just leads to, well, I mean, I don't want to say it always leads to a lot of people getting killed, but I guess it doesn't necessarily have to. It just seems to. I'm not entirely. It's just like there's a whole, I guess, slippery slope. But like typically that's a fallacy, but it's kind of true in this case, right? When you start picking out features, they are like, okay, the ideal citizen, like you could start with, can't speak out against the government. And then you can go to, like less extreme thought, like the ideal citizen can't think about like masturbating or something like that. I don't know, so some weird shit. And then you can start looking at characteristics, like, the blonde hair, blue eyes sort of things, and you start whittling people down in that way. And it seems like, I mean, if you are striving for that ideal citizen, it seems like it almost requires some process to remove the ones that you don't want, right? And so that thought process always seems like it will lead down a bad road.
Yes, and you're very right about that. And that is the dark mirror of the idea that I'm talking about. But if we were to kind of reinterpret that idea in a more flattering light or in a more generous light, we might say that a fascist movement would uh, conceive of an ideal citizen and encourage a kind of virtue to flourish and flower among its citizenry while not punishing vice the way that fascist movements in the past have, or not punishing people being different the way that fascist movements in the past have, and even embracing a kind of diversity. But because diversity doesn't necessarily conflict with virtue. But it's really virtue, I think, that I would like to stress. If we were to bring any kind of element of fascistic thought back into the 21st century, a recontextualization, a reanalysis of that idea of the model citizen in fascism as being about basically doing good things, having a sense of duty, and caring about the people around you, and having strength and a spirit of self-sacrifice. I think that those are great, wholesome values that pretty much are universally accepted and lauded.
Okay, well, how about this then? Because I think almost by definition, like you end up having to like whittle down diversity. Yeah, that, like there's an exclusion of diversity in that thought process. Like almost once again by definition. But like let's say okay, so you mentioned duty a few times. So let's say however you ended up defining it. What would you do with people that didn't like exemplify that virtue? That didn't like that weren't like they weren't hitting that standard. What would you do with those people? Or what would you suggest?
I don't think that there's much. Yeah, I don't think there's much you can do with them other than encourage them. Obviously, a more unscrupulous regime might have various nefarious plans for what to do with the subversives and the deviants, but that's definitely not the kind of government that I would want to live under. And I think that it would be very, it would be against our best interests to have that kind of authoritarianism that is very oppressive and socially restrictive. So I think it's more about encouragement. It's more about setting an example to follow. And I do think, this is one area where I disagree with fascism. Fascism tends to not really value critical thinking in the individual. That's something that I would change. I think that my ideal revisionist fascist nation would it's silly to even talk this way, but my ideal nation and national zeitgeist would promote a spirit of critical thinking and a spirit of independence of thought. So yeah, that is definitely an area where I have a lot of difference with the classical ideal of fascism.
Well, I would argue that what you described when it comes to the ideal citizen, we already do that to an extent, right? In America, we already push for someone that's very patriotic, that's very hardworking, that's brave, that takes care of their family and their loved ones. But we never force that on people, right? And I would say that like the same thing when it comes to the other traits of fascism we've talked about, like the other virtues that you've brought up, like when it comes to being able to act quickly with the government, we already have that to an extent, but in a way that's not oppressive to the people. So I guess, okay, so let me lay out America and just kind of relay out my points when it comes to like fascism versus what we already have. So when it comes to being able to control like capitalism, the markets, once again, we already do that to a large extent. I don't think there's any capitalist society that has unregulated markets, right? It's kind of a requirement of capitalism. So you don't really need fascism when it comes to control over the markets for the good of the people. When it comes to quick action, once again, like quick action can be good, but if you have a lot of it in a very short amount of time, going from like left to right, if there's no consistency there, it can be devastating for society. But it's also so that's why I would advocate for a more slower process like we have when it comes to Congress and like the checks and balances. But once again, it's good to have that fast action in our back pocket, and that's why we have. That's one of the big reasons why we have the president. And then when it comes to the ideal citizen, once again, I feel like we already try to push those virtues without forcing them, and I feel like most fascist societies end up forcing them. So like I feel like we've already accomplished a lot of the things that you're wanting to accomplish through fascism, without the fascism. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think where I'm at is I look at this issue more philosophically, and I look at the philosophy of the people living in my country, and I see a lot of things that I think can be improved on. I specifically am talking about the conservatives who I have a lot of distaste for in the way that they think about the government in that they just hate taxation. They never want to be taxed. They never want the government to infringe on their liberty to do what they want with their businesses. And they want to keep their guns no matter what. And they all have this skepticism towards science, skepticism toward who they call the elites. It seems like they just want to dumb everything down to the lowest common denominator, not listen to anyone with any kind of expertise. And I just look at that situation and think, perhaps we need more elitism. Perhaps we need more of a respect for the institution of government. Perhaps we need more of a collective spirit. And so I look at what fascism was trying to accomplish, and I see those goals as quite noble. And maybe on a practical level, you could say that, well, what do we not already have now that fascism can provide? And maybe that's not an easy question for me to answer, because I think I'm taking more of a broad cultural look at this and thinking about the values that we have and how counterproductive they feel to me.
So to touch on the conservative thing a little bit, I would agree that a lot of the values they push. Well, I'm very liberal, so I would disagree with a lot of it. But it's kind of we almost have like a natural balance between the parties, right? Because it's good to be given to society, but only to an extent. And so I would say in that example, in that case, Democrats kind of exemplify that sort of like it's good to like be a little bit more collective, help each other out a little bit more, and then the conservatives are kind of like the counterpole there, so we don't go too far. And I would say that you could say that for a lot of things going down that path, because everything's good in moderation, right? Like I guess that's more or less what I'm trying to say. Even though I feel like the Conservative Party has gone a little bit wild when it comes to like science denial and stuff like that, like denying climate change. At this point, I'm not entirely sure how you would even do that. You would have to just completely distrust science as a whole. But so there are definitely some problems there, and it's not completely even. I would like to iron out those spaces where it's not. But once again, I would say like with the other things, there is like somewhat of a solution in the system we have currently. There's once again a counterbalance, or like both sides are pulling in the opposite direction, and it kind of leaves us in this like middle ground, right?
I'm not so sure that I think the balance we have is a balance that I like. I think we can talk about the conservatives being there as a counterbalance. And I think it's good to have some sort of intellectual counterbalance to the idea of collectivism and all that. But I think really what they're doing is pulling the country in an unproductive direction. And so I don't really see the pitfalls of the collectivist vision as much as I see the pitfalls of the conservative direction as it exists now in America. And so to me, maybe I just have rose-tinted glasses about this because the grass is greener on the other side. But I'm itching for some change. I'm itching for something else, something better than what we're currently dealing with.
I am not at all. The Trump stuff actually scares the crap out of me. I was so glad when Biden somehow managed to unseat him, because Jesus Christ, moderates, boring ass old men moderates are just so great compared to whatever the fuck Trump is. But So you said okay. So you can see the pitfalls of like a conservative way, an individualistic way of thinking, more than you can a collectivist one. Well, like once again, like I think there's a fundamental issue with being like wholly collectivist, like we talked about earlier on. It's there's almost no point at that point for like a citizen, an individual, to like agree to that contract. Yeah, like do you know what I mean? Like because if literally their entire existence is served for something other than them, then like once again, I wouldn't want to have anything to do with that system. I want to be able to focus on what's good for me as well. Probably more so. And I feel like as long as people are made to help to a certain extent, but then can focus on like benefiting themselves, I feel like that's like I feel like overall that's the best sort of balance to strike when it comes to creating a nice, healthy society. So like over collectivization, I do think leads to issues. Like when it comes, well, I mean individual liberty, which I guess, God, there's a problem with that because you said you don't necessarily value that in and of itself. Once again, if people aren't able to work in their own best interest, I just think like there's just no benefit at that point for that individual to be in that society. I think that's the main issue with that sort of thought. But
Yeah, I can see that. I think that if everyone put put the interests of other people before themselves, I think we would find that the society we're living in is much more pleasant to live in than the one we currently live in, where people are much more self-interested.
But that's not exactly what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about people benefiting other people or helping out other people. We're talking about people like giving themselves entirely to their nation, right?
Right.
Well, there's a difference in my mind there. Like,
so where would you say the yeah, explain that.
So I would say, obviously, it's good to be like good to your neighbors and whatnot. Well, like, oh God, okay. So difference between focusing more on the good of everyone else versus the good of the nation. Well, I would say, I guess maybe the good of the government is more or less what I'm talking about, or what their interests are. Mm-hmm. It seems like that's more of the focus of like a fascist nation when it comes to the individual, because like things can get really fun. We've seen fascist nations get pretty bad. Like the majority of people in fascist nations didn't seem to be prospering for sure. So it seems like whatever they were helping was something other than everybody else. It seemed to be like the nation, right? I can see how
that's definitely a valid criticism.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it all kind of depends on the prerogatives of the specific government. If you have a good government, then obviously it would be in all of our best interest to serve that government. But if we have a bad government, then obviously it wouldn't. And so there are definitely problems inherent in the idea of a political ideology that puts service to the government first and foremost. And perhaps that's why I would prefer to kind of recontextualize the collectivist ideal of fascism as the government exists to kind of give life and give space to the nation, but the collectivist spirit of the citizen should not be focused on the government as some sort of abstract authority figure, but it should be focused on the community around us and how we can benefit the community in doing good things. And so, yeah, you're probably right in that fascism historically has placed too much emphasis on this sort of idea of obedience to authority. And actually, obedience, like the fascist motto, I don't like the fascist motto, credere, obbedire, combattere, which is believe, obey, fight. The obey part is the part that I take special issue with. And I don't think it's a great virtue to just be in blind obedience to whatever some authority says. And so I think we're mostly on the same page about this.
Well, in that case, yeah, it sounds like you might be like I feel like you can find everything you're talking about within a republic, or a sort of setup that we like, maybe something a little bit different, but like everything you've brought up, we exhibit it in one form or another in our society, like as it stands. I'm not sure if like we necessarily need fascism to push for those things, or if you want more of those things. Once again, I don't think I need to like completely overhaul the system to get there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean, and I think there are probably adjustments that we can make to get us more toward a kind of society that I would like. But I definitely think that you're wise to have a moderate view on this. I think you're wise to not want to just full steam ahead into some radical revision of the government system. Um, and I think that definitely I don't like the idea of autocratic government or government or one party control. And so I think we're more or less in agreement here, but I think where I'm coming from is more like I said about the values and the way that we as individuals understand our relationship to the government and relationship to society. I think on a personal level, if I could do some good in affecting a change of thought in that way, then I will be satisfied.
Well, so the autocratic part that you brought up, it kind of that's a great example of what I'm talking. I feel like maybe you're wanting something other than fascism, because it seems like fascism is like, it's not like, I'm pretty, like I said at the beginning of this, I feel like dictatorship is almost like a fundamental aspect, like one party, one ruler sort of like mentality. That's like an aspect of fascism. So I don't know if you can have fascism without the autocracy or that authoritarian like dictatorship. So like, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it depends, because one of the kind of eye-opening things I discovered in my research was that British fascism, as proposed by the BUF, the British Union of Fascists, did not reject democracy, and they wanted to have a democratically elected parliament that had power over the government, that could check the power of the government. But they also wanted a more streamlined type of government where elected ministers could act a lot more quickly and a lot more decisively. And so I think that there's a balance that can be struck. And the fascist mentality is not necessarily, it's skeptical of democracy, but it's not necessarily anti-democratic, and it's not necessarily autocratic. There are different ways to conceive a radical revision of society.
I suppose that's potentially true. I'm not, there's not even like, I know there's not even like a hard and fast like definition of what fascism is. So it's that's a tricky thing to argue. It just seems like that's one of the things that you kind of have to man, but I'm not, I need to do more research when it comes to fascism in order to like truly be like ready for a conversation like this. But overall, I would argue, just to kind of like, I guess, cap this part of the conversation off, I would argue that everything you're looking for can be found in society as it stands. And I think fascism tends to have it brings a lot of baggage with it that it just ends up like getting in the way of society as a whole. That would be, I guess, my final argument when it comes to, but anyways.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
So I don't know. You said you've watched some of my videos. Have you seen the response to some of those guys? How are you feeling about my
Well, the one that introduced me to your channel was the video about Vosh talking about the Joe Cat situation and how he was unironic heterophobia. That was interesting. And you mentioned that Vosh was your introduction into politics. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. So for a while I was pretty, I wouldn't say apolitical. I've always been like left leaning, but I don't even know how I ended up getting into like online politics, but I did at one point, probably like maybe 4 years ago or so, and I did end up watching a lot of Vosh. Um, Over time, dude, there are certain things that even when you're a fan of, I don't know how it doesn't bug you. Like, okay, first off, just like baseline, his fucking use or his pronunciation of words, he mispronounces things to sound smarter, which is ironic, but he does. It's really fucking annoying. Secondly, how he talks about like Republicans is just disgusting. It's absolutely gross. They're not fucking evil. Like the best example I have is when it comes to like abortion. He understands why Republicans believe in abortion, or that abortion is immoral. Sorry. Like they think that you're killing a baby, right? Like they think they're trying to stop a baby genocide. So like obviously that the intentions are very much not evil. There, they can be like they might be a little bit like led astray there, and I would agree with that to an extent, but they're definitely not evil. It's just like certain things like that. It makes you start wondering like why is he a thing? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's the abortion thing is such a common fallacy you see all over the pro-choice side of people just not getting it through their thick fucking skulls that we're talking about that the pro-life people are talking about how they think that it's murder. And so you have to engage with it on that level. You can't just wimp out and say, well, my body, my choice. Like to these people, it's not your body. It's someone else's body that you are killing. So you have to meet them where they're at. And there's just a lot of blindness on this issue where the pro-choice people are unable to just like somehow they just it doesn't sink in for them.
Well, to be fair, pro-life people can be really, really weird when it comes to talking about pro-choice people as well. It can be definitely a both sides thing there. But I would say overall, like when it comes to abortion, I guess this might be an interesting topic of discussion. For me, it's when a fetus becomes a child, like at what point in that process that actually happens, when it becomes something we should value, is like that is a purely philosophical question without a clear answer, and that's why I say we should definitely value the person that we know is in existence, more than the person like the potential life, whenever that life might actually begin. Like we should value the person more. So that's why I think. Yeah, if that makes sense. Fuck, there was something else that was part of that. That I'm brain farting hard. But essentially, that's my argument. Is that we should value the person we already have more than the potential person, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I don't think I have as much respect for human life as other people do. I don't really value human life the way other people do. And so I see it kind of from a more detached perspective. And I think about, what if I were to accidentally get pregnant, I mean, it would be a real drag. So like, I don't want, that's an inconvenience that I wouldn't want to deal with. So I don't want to force anyone else to deal with it. And if it means sacrificing the life of someone who barely has any kind of conscious awareness of themselves, I'm totally willing to make that sacrifice. It's not a kind thing to do to that person, but ultimately I think it's worth it. You gotta break a few eggs sometimes.
Yeah, I would say it got. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. I would trade out the word inconvenient for potentially like life ruining, because that's potentially what women are facing, right? Especially if you have like a young pregnancy, you're throwing out like any idea of like going to college, or at least like maybe not any idea. It's possible to go to college when you have a kid, but like if you don't have the proper support networks, it's just like, and especially when that baby's super, like when it just popped, it's still super fresh, like pursuing your own, like making your own life becomes almost fucking impossible. And then there's just like, the fucking carrying it for 9 months, having to go through all that pain. The pain of childbirth, the potential costs that come along with all of it, not to mention just having to support the kid, right? I guess that would make it impossible to go to college if you already hadn't. Just the simple fact that you need to get a job to support that kid. It's not just inconvenience, it's like potentially like life destroying. Sorry, I'm nitpicking what you said just a little bit, but like I think that sort of argument would help you get that point across to people a little bit better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't think many people really think the way I do or like the way I think because I have a very kind of nihilistic perspective on life. And so for me, I tend to just put things very bluntly as, yeah, fuck fetuses. That tends to be my mentality toward things more than trying to like, oh, well, look, try to see it from this perspective. I'm just like, fuck it.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I oh man, it's just oh, I've actually, I mean, it's never smart to argue politics with your coworkers, but I've actually had this sort of argument. And dude, if I came out with the "fuck your fetus," I don't know if I would have done it anyway. But anyway, well, and, there's also like just from like an emotional standpoint for me, I think overall people should have the choice to get an abortion. But dude, like if I got a girl pregnant on accident, I would have such a hard time not seeing that as my baby, like just right out the gate. That'd be I feel like that would mind fuck me like instantly. So I don't. Yeah, it's tricky. I would say it's tricky from a philosophical perspective and an emotional one. It's just a messy area, but I think the most good comes from letting women get abortions whenever they want to or need to. But yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think sometimes people unexpectedly find that having a kid was something that they never wanted, but then when they actually do it, they kind of change their mind on that. And so I think that there is a nuance in there where we can talk about it being life ruining, but we can also acknowledge that
I'm sorry,
it can be unexpectedly a good thing. It can unexpectedly be something.
Okay,
Are you good?
No. Apparently my laptop is not plugged in and the battery's dying. It's fucking plugged
Okay.
in. Just 1 second.
Okay.
Are you actually plugged in now? You son of a bitch. Okay, it should be good. It should be good. Jesus.
All right.
Maybe that's why I was having so much trouble at the beginning with my laptop because it wasn't actually it's on it doesn't use up as much battery when it's not plugged in, and that might be what was happening. But anyways, so yeah, back to the Joe Cat thing. The reception to that video was not great. If you looked at the comment section, it wasn't. People did not like what I had to say. What are your opinions on that?
Yeah. I guess your position was basically it's cringy because it's cringy, and it's not about quote heterophobic harassment, which I thought that was a hilarious take from Vosh because it's kind of correct in that they are making fun of a guy for talking about how he's attracted to women, and that's kind of there's a weird sort of ironic. It's like it's gay to like women thing coming out of that, which I find interesting, and you actually see that sort of phenomenon in a lot of different places. Like people like I heard that I saw a Reddit thread where someone asked like, what are the weirdest things that you've heard called gay? And someone's like, there are people who have unironically told me that it's gay to like really girly girls. And so you get that weird shit where like just like being a genuine human being expressing affection to other people is considered unmanly, it's considered effeminate. And so I can definitely see where Vosh is coming from in that it's reflecting a wider social phenomenon there. But on some level, I do agree with you that, cringe is cringe.
Well, it's not just that. I would say that heterophobia thing is just nonsense. You can criticize how heterophobia is expressed without criticizing you can criticize heterosexuality and how it's, oh my God, you can criticize how it's expressed without criticizing the sexuality itself, right? Like, and we do this all the time. Like, if you have a coworker that like fucking slaps like another coworker's ass or something like that would be a bad way to express your heterosexuality, right? But when you're criticizing that, you're not criticizing the drive of that behavior. You're just criticizing the behavior, like how they expressed it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, but I sometimes get the impression that a lot of feminists just hate the idea that men find them attractive. And and so you get a lot of talk about like, oh, they're always sexually objectifying us, when it's even in the case of the Joe Cat video, people were making that criticism against Joe Cat when he was just talking about how he likes girls. So I do think that strangely, I think if we want to say that heterophobia exists, where you're most likely to find it is in feminism.
I don't necessarily here. Let me. I'm gonna rehash like essentially the main points of that video because I feel I did not do a good job of explaining myself. Even though even if I had, I swear to God, just saying that I thought it was cringe was enough to get everybody to do that shit. First off, I did not condone the harassment in any way, shape, or form, especially like in real life stuff. That stuff is scary. That's very serious. But it was hilarious because I got like half of the messages I fucking got were people saying, "Oh, you're saying you deserve the harassment? What the fuck?" Is like, no, I literally said the exact opposite, like 100, just so many times in the video, in the fucking comment section. I've said so many times he did not deserve it. But no, I would say. It can be hard to describe why something is cringe, but first off, Vasha, that was a weird take from him. Like finding something cringe is not like a weakness. There's obviously a reason why people like have that feeling about those things, right? Like it helps us navigate social situations. Like it's an important ability to like see when something's awkward or out of place in a social setting. That's essentially what cringe is, right? It helps us avoid it in the future ourselves, right? So it is once again hard to put into words why I found it cringe, but there's a cheesiness to those lyrics, like the pretty kitty girls, dude. I can't. It's so hard for me to put it into words. But I've been writing lyrics for like a decade now, and those sorts of. I know that he didn't make them, but they came out of his fucking mouth. Okay, and it's hard to put into words. What? Also, I compared him to one of my favorite bands, Weezer. They're like the king of cheese. All right, so it's not like no one got the positive side of what I was saying about this stuff. But anyways, I would say there are definitely, it's like, if you're being reasonable about it, it's really easy to see how like another person might see certain aspects of that video as cringe, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's cutesy, and that kind of disturbs a lot of people. I think there's a fine line between cute and terrifying, and it can kind of unnerve people on a social level to see someone embarrass themselves by being so genuine.
Yeah, well, it's not just like oh man, like I genuinely can see how someone might see that for the first time, not knowing who Joe Cat is, and be like, wow, that was kind of pervy. He's like talking about like all these sexy types of girls or whatever. Like it's just like, when it comes to talking about what you're interested in, and I think we all know this to one extent or another, there's a time and a place. Like maybe if you're hanging out with some close friends, you can talk about how you saw this girl at the fucking store today and she's like just so fucking hot, dude. She had the biggest, finest ass. Like, oh my God, her hair was fucking gorgeous. But if you do that at work, if you start just talking about how horny you are about that girl, like in a work setting, like that's going to be, and the internet's like, I mean, obviously it's not like a professional environment, but that's kind of the problem. Like everybody, if you give people an opportunity to shit on you, they're probably going to do it. I've definitely found that out through my videos, but yeah, so I wouldn't call the video cringy, or sorry, not cringy. I wouldn't call it pervy, like he was being pervy. But I could definitely see how people, especially not super used to the internet, could find it to be pervy.
Yeah, I just think that his way of doing it is so different from the typical heterosexual male perviness. Like he doesn't do any of that kind of masculine posturing of trying to be aloof and act like you don't care that you're attracted to people. Like he was displaying, I guess, what would be more of a feminine kind of sexuality, even though it was heterosexual male talk. And that kind of thing, I think, is more accepted when women do it. I think that it's a lot harder for men to express themselves in express their sexual feelings in a way that doesn't either feel A, pervy, or B, cringy and gay.
No, I would agree. I would agree, and I think that is a bit of a failing when it comes to like societal expectations of men. Yeah, I think if a guy wants to be that sort of like submissive type of dude towards women, or just present himself like that, not saying Joe Cat is like in real life or anything, but like it shouldn't be that big of a deal. People shouldn't have that much of a problem with it. Like it, yeah. But of course, you know, and as society stands, it's still. Well, I guess it hardcore depends on where you live. But if you are even a slightly effeminate guy in some like cultures or like places in America, it can you just get fucking wrecked. There's just no hope. I think that's a problem. But
Yeah. So where do we go from here?
I'm not sure. How do you feel about socialism and communism? There's also an interesting response or reception to the videos I made on those guys.
Right. Well, I think I responded to one of your videos about that
Was I super aggressive
a week or
towards
two
you?
ago.
I might have been an asshole.
I
I
know
honestly don't know.
you no, you were fairly polite, at least
Okay.
in my reckoning. I have quite a high tolerance for that sort of thing, so I didn't take it personally. But
Okay, good.
no, I'm a socialist. I call myself a socialist. I even will occasionally call myself a communist, but only if I am using those terms as synonymous, which is one way to use them. There are multiple definitions of both of those words. But generally, I'm a socialist in a very general sense. I think that it's a lot of the problems that we experience economically uh, are stemming from the fact that capital is under the control of these sort of overlords who have the ability to do whatever they want with that capital. But I do recognize that there are definitely limitations. There are definitely pitfalls to socialism, and I don't know if I'm entirely even convinced of the market socialist cooperative strategy, which is the one that I have the most sympathy for. But generally, I do like socialist politics.
Okay, so I would say, I guess to sum up my thoughts where they stand after, and by the way, dude, socialists and communists are definitely, I will say this about them, some of the most well-spoken people I have fucking argued with on the internet so far. But it seems
Oh
like,
yeah, they're nerds.
yeah, very much so. But I would say capitalism, even when not implemented super duper well, still ends up creating a ton of fucking wealth for the country. And of course, there are problems with that, like with distribution of that wealth. But it seems like overall, capitalism is really good about raising the standard of living for everybody, and where it fails when it comes to that, we can have the government step in and fix those things. It seems like it seems like capitalism works really well for the majority of people. My problem with social, and dude, the main thing that mind fucked me with this is the whole "it's never been tried" thing. Look, I got the best analogy I have is okay. So let me lay out like the steps of socialism, like as I see them. So first off, you form a vanguard party. Like I know there's definitely a lot of criticism when it comes to vanguard parties, but you need to seize control of the government somehow, and a revolution seems to be like the number one choice. So you form a vanguard party, you seize power, and then you establish a government that's supposed to bring into reality that socialist and then probably communist society later down the road. That never seems to work. That beginning part of the process never seems to work. Yes, they do capture the government, but they're never able to fully like get the government to implement socialism. And I always think of it like, let's say you have a bullet, and or just like a specific kind of bullet. Every time you try to use it, the firing pin goes into the back and nothing happens. That primer never gets set off. And now what I would do if I saw that happen like over and over, I kept trying all these different bullets, all of these different bullets within the same group of bullet, and none of them ever went off. I would think to myself, like, well, these bullets are absolute garbage. These are shit. They never fucking work. And then someone, I guess you could point out, like, no, it's not the bullet. It's the primer, okay? The bullet could fly perfectly well. You have no idea. But it's just the shitty primer. It's like, okay, sure, I guess, but if the primer never works, then, like, the bullet's never going to fly, and this is all theoretical anyway. It doesn't even matter. Like, that's that's where I'm at when it comes to socialism and communism. It seems like it's just impossible to implement them.
Yeah, from what I understand, I am by no means an expert on this sort of history, but from what I understand, it seems that a lot of the problems with Marxist-Leninist socialist states kind of get down to the issue of having to relinquish control, because a whole like an essential component of socialism is the relinquishment of control of a small group of people, whether that's capitalists or, in the case of Marxism Leninism, of party leaders, and the assumption of control by the actual workers themselves. And it seems that the Marxist Leninists are never comfortable with giving up that control. And I think a lot of it is just down to the fact that capitalism is powerful. Capitalism is attractive. Capitalism has propaganda on its side. And capitalism works in a lot of ways.
Wait,
and so it's hard for them to...
So
yes, yeah.
How does capitalism weigh on, like, so obviously these people that seize control of the government and try to establish socialism, well, how does capitalism weigh on their inability to relinquish power?
I think like... because we don't have a worldwide revolution, and that's kind of what Trotsky was about. He was like, well, the whole world needs to turn socialist all at once for it to work. And then Stalin was like, nah, maybe we can just build socialism in one country. But what that ended up meaning was that you can't actually create socialism, because the rest of the world isn't going along with the program, and the rest of the world is trying to undermine it. The rest of the world is, arming insurgents. The rest of the world is spilling out a bunch of propaganda and trying to get that propaganda into these socialist countries, so that the people who have power then are like, well, maybe capitalism is the way to go. Maybe we like the old way.
Well, it's not even just that. Hold on. I pointed this out in my video, or one of my recent videos. I got a really like thought-provoking message from somebody under, was it my second video on socialism? Yes, it was my second one. So I love this. If communism was a scientific experiment, it's been tested in every single climate, civilization, or income range. It's also had all kinds of alternatives, such as Trotskyite, Stalinist, Maoist, Arab, or Third World. Communists always act as if they are the underdog, and one of their biggest arguments is that they failed due to the lack of support from the liberal capitalist world. However, the great irony is that for most of the Cold War, the communists controlled a large geographic area, a third of the human race, and far more people than the capitalist world. I think that's, well, he's right. He's absolutely right. Like, it seems like communism, especially during the Cold War, had like every opportunity to succeed, but it still didn't.
Yeah, and I think a big reason is that they maybe psyched themselves out with the fear that capitalism would creep back in if they relinquished that control. And so it made them really fortify themselves and become super authoritarian.
And that's another interesting question. Do you think that once a vanguard party's like got a hold on power, do you think there's, because it's never been done, do you think there's ever like a world where they actually relinquish control? And do you think that would actually work out?
I'm not certain about that. So I'm not really a fan of the whole revolutionary aspect of socialism. I do see that maybe it has the people, the proponents of it, raise some good points. But when it comes to, the idea of a vanguard party relinquishing control and whether that would work, I think that it might at least jumpstart us to a great deal if they first dismantle the whole scheme of private capital and socialize it. If they are able to accomplish that first, and then through these worker councils or whatever the fuck they're trying to do, through these councils, empower these councils and give them the ability to decide what's to be done. It's an interesting experiment, and I don't think that experiment has ever been tried before because there's always that fear of it not working. And so that's something that I don't know. I don't know how that would work, but I have a suspicion that it might at least get us further along toward a socialist goal. But at the same time, if you dismantle the institution of private capital, that's going to result in a lot of destabilization. So I don't know if they can even get the economy stable enough at that point for it to work.
And that was one of my thoughts. The other one is, so even if you got to a place where it seems like the economy was running fine, everything was co-opified, and there was no real central government, how would a country like that handle like large things, like where the entire society needs to get together and solve an issue, like a war or something? How would that work?
Well, I guess the theory is that it would all be done democratically with councils sending delegates to bigger councils, and then those councils sending delegates to bigger councils, and then the largest council would then be able to democratically make decisions on that kind of stuff.
Well, going back to kind of our fascism talk. It seems like that process would be insanely slow. There would need to be some form of like centralization in order to make quick decisions, like where you could pull the whole country one way or another, right?
Yeah, that is a good point. I'm not really sure how they would address that kind of concern. Obviously, the socialist countries that we've seen already didn't bother with any of that, and they just had an inner party circle that called all the shots and did everything that they wanted to do. Right. So I don't really know, because the system that I'm describing is called Soviet democracy, even though it doesn't really have much to do with the way that the Soviet Union actually operated. So I don't know if an actual Soviet democratic system would be just too slow to work, or if they would come up, they would probably come up with some workarounds, just structurally to make it faster.
Maybe it's just, I mean, once again, there have been opportunities for countries to go this route, and it just seems like it just hasn't happened. I don't know. I'm super jaded when it comes to that. Like the idea of democracy in the workplace, that doesn't seem necessarily bad to me. My main question would be, is it more effective, or at least roughly as effective as the standard business model? Because if we're losing a shit ton of practicality along with that worker democracy, I don't know. There's definitely a point where that doesn't it stops being worth it. Or would you say that letting people have that democracy is always worth it, no matter what the cost to our economy is?
I don't think it would be always worth it, but I do think that, I've heard good things about the cooperative model, but I've also heard some bad things. I've heard that some cooperatives have trouble keeping themselves afloat. So I don't really know the details of that. Who is an expert on that kind of stuff is Vosh. He could give you a whole earful on cooperatives.
Dude. I don't know if Vosh is an expert. First off, I don't even know if there are enough co-ops to have enough information as to how effective they are. I don't even. It just seems like there aren't that many, so it's hard to tell, right? But secondly, dude, Vosh. I'm not sure. I've made 3 or 4 videos where I'm hyper fucking critical of them, and one of those was over dude, socialists seem to have this idea that if you go to a socialist economy, it'll just fix global warming because everybody's really good intentioned and agrees that climate change is happening and all that. I'm just no, there's so many things that aren't just granted when it comes to that economic system. What do you think about that? Vosh arguing that if we went over to socialism, climate change wouldn't be a problem. What do you think about that?
Well, you do kind of raise a good point, which is that, what's the alternative to using fossil fuels? Where is the path forward? Obviously, there are things that we can do to get us closer to that, but it's not just going to change on a dime, because right now we're just too dependent on fossil fuels, whether we're living under a capitalist or socialist economy. But I will say that I think that on the ground level, there's probably more support, more drive, I guess, to switch to green energy than on the top floor. Just from the the average person, doesn't want to see the climate get fucked up beyond repair,
Well, the
which is
average
already
person-
going to happen. We can't change it.
If we take the average person and like flip a coin to see it's a coin flip as to whether or not they even take climate change seriously, right? It seems like half the country is either apathetic towards it
Yeah.
or doesn't even believe it's happening. And socialism doesn't address that issue, or would you say it does?
Well, one way it might mitigate those problems is the fact that the only reason people really think that way, I guess there are two reasons. One, maybe they live in West Virginia and they're coal miners and they're worried about their job getting outmoded. That's one reason. Another reason is that they're just infected by all this vicious propaganda that's being put out by the capitalists. And so if we remove the capitalists, would that then help the green message? Would that remove an obstacle in the form of just the social kind of mental game of it?
That is actually that's a decent point. There's a lot of propaganda out there when it comes to climate change denial. But how about this? Let's say you do. Do you think people will just naturally start believing in climate change or taking it seriously? They've been mind fucked by the capitalists, and now we move over to a socialist economy. That propaganda doesn't exist anymore, really. Do you think people would start to take it more seriously, or what about when it comes to I don't know, like job security or being able to that's another question too. Are we talking about a form of socialism that gets rid of the commodity form or keeps it?
In my mind, I never ventured toward the abandonment of markets. That's just never something I even really consider. To me, it feels like a pipe dream.
Okay, so in that case, you would still have that profit motive clouding people's judgment. So you can
Yes.
still easily see people polluting just as much as they do today, right? So
Yeah, and there would be a motivation for people to kind of cut costs, because fossil fuels they're a very cheap and convenient and plentiful source of energy right now. So there would still be a motivation to but I think you're definitely where you're going to get the most problem is from the fossil fuel cooperatives. They're going to be the people who are still pumping out the propaganda. But
literally, yeah.
I don't-
As long as the
I don't
commodity
know.
They're still, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so I don't know how the dynamics would shift. That would be interesting. I'm definitely not as confident as Vosh in how Vosh says, well, definitely cooperatives are the answer. Cooperatives will solve everything. I remember one time he was talking with Destiny about this, and Destiny was like, oh, what can we actually do to solve the climate problem? And Vosh started talking about cooperatives, and Destiny was just immediately like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like,
Yeah, how does that actually
stop with this
resonate?
long-term
Yeah.
pie in the sky vision.
Well, no, so, I mean-
Look at what can our government actually do?
Yeah, well, there's that. First off, the saying revolution is like the answer to all our problems is really weird, and probably is probably not going to happen, right? So we need like real world, like shorter term solutions to these issues, and that's why, dude, I lost my shit when Vosh does not seem to understand what cap and trade is. When he was talking about it, he said like, oh, there's a cap on how much pollution these companies can give off or whatever, but they can still trade it. So it's like whatever. That it just goes completely missing the point of the trading aspect. And the reason why there's still an overall cap on how much everybody can pollute, right? But if someone's polluting a little bit under their quota or whatever, they can trade off the excess to another business, and you still end up with the same amount of pollution. So he doesn't even understand cap and trade. Wait, that bothered the fuck out of me. Cap and trade seems to be the only viable solution we have while we're still pushing towards green energy and making that more of a viable thing, right?
Yeah, what do you think about nuclear power? Because I am a subscriber of Thunderfoot, and that guy is a big nuclear head. And I like the idea is very attractive to me as just like a very easy solution that's right at our fingertips if we only just grasp it. But I've also heard like the amazing atheist is very against nuclear power, and he talks about the environmental problems with storing all of that toxic waste. Like how do we deal with that in the long term? And so what do you think about it?
That is actually a really good point. Yeah, being able to store. Well, I mean, if we did switch over to even like half run, or like especially if we went to like the fully like fucking nuclear powered sort of society, there would be a shit ton of waste, and figuring out how to dispose of that would be a huge challenge. That's true. I have no idea exactly how we would go about that. It seems like burying it all wouldn't necessarily be the best thing to do. I think nuclear power does seem to be overall a really safe and effective way to generate power. I was talking to my little brother about this maybe like a year ago, and we looked it up. I think there have only been like maybe under 200 nuclear power plants in the entire world, and only 2 of them have gone critical. Like only 2 of them have actually failed. It seems like they're actually pretty fucking safe. Yeah, how many? I'm curious now. Hold on. How many nuclear power plants?
Yeah, and one of them was Chernobyl, I guess.
I'm sorry, 667 reactors, and I'm pretty sure, only two or three have ever like failed. I don't know why I was remembering under like 200. I was way off, but 667 reactors have been built worldwide. And only a couple of them have ever failed. So it seems like they have a really good success rate. But disposing of the waste, that is definitely a huge fucking issue. So I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, to me it just feels like, oh man, we are wasting a really good opportunity for a huge abundant source of energy if we are willing to just kowtow to the fear of what if something goes wrong. Like, I get it, we want to be responsible about it, but to me it just seems like, man, what a missed opportunity it would be if we don't take it. And meanwhile, the fossil fuels are just pushing us at an ever accelerating rate toward total disaster.
Right, it's kind of ironic when we talk about it, like, oh, nuclear power is super dangerous, yet fossil fuel, like getting power from fossil fuels is like actually destroying our environment. So it's a little, I'm not,
yeah. Like, one thing is actually already happening at an alarming rate, and there's something we can do to slow it down. It might have some disastrous consequences if we fuck up along the way, but I would rather take that chance.
I need to look more into it, especially when it comes to disposal. That is definitely probably the biggest sticking point. Being able to safely handle all of that waste. I'm not sure. But either way, it almost doesn't matter at this point because public perception when it comes to nuclear power is just so fucked. It doesn't even really matter. But
yeah, and public perception when it comes to fossil fuels even is still fucked. I mean, we are so far behind where we need to be in order to have any hope of saving ourselves that it's kind of depressing.
yeah, well, every year, green energy becomes, cheaper. Like solar panels, crap like that, it's cheaper to produce and more efficient overall. So hopefully we'll reach a point where once again we can just kind of move over to mainly like green energy, like power system. But I have no idea.
Yeah, I've heard that it's actually getting so cheap at this point that it's becoming the economical option. So that would be, the saving grace if people just if it's just no longer financially viable to use fossil fuels anymore.
Yeah, and then we can get those like industrializing countries like India to switch over to green energy. Like if it actually becomes like a viable thing, we could get like everybody to switch over to green energy, and then we wouldn't have to worry about. Well, we would still have to because we've already set off a lot of bad things potentially when it comes to global warming. So we'd still have to try to find ways to work around that, like fucking air, like essentially like atmosphere scrubbers, right? Like big things that like take as much of the CO2 out of the atmosphere as possible. And replanting forests. That also seems, but I mean, a lot of that deforestation came about because of farming. And if you get rid of a shit ton of farmland, you're potentially making a shit ton of people starve. So I don't know. I'm not really sure. It's all very complicated. I don't know.
Yeah. any kind of carbon removal strategy from what I've seen, it seems like that stuff is just really inefficient, and
I
so
can
there's
see
no
that.
way to actually get a net gain from that. And I don't know if there ever will be, just from the laws of thermodynamics themselves. I don't know if they would even allow that to become a viable reality. But like maybe a long-term thing. Once we've already moved entirely to green energy, we can consider maybe getting some of the carbon out of the air at that point.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not. I guess we'll just see what happens, dude. I don't know. We might already be kind of fucked, but I mean, probably not. I don't know if we're like at like end of civilization like levels or anything. People like to talk like that. Oh God, that's an interesting question. So I'm sure you've seen videos pop up like on YouTube about like a potential like second civil war. Well, I'm not even sure. You sound American. I'm not sure if you live in America, but like, I guess what do you think?
Yes.
Well, what do you think about that possibility? I mean, politics have been heating up quite a fucking bit, and Trump might actually make play for power again. So, I mean, what do you think? I think the likelihood's still
Yeah.
pretty
Well,
small, but
when you analyze the trends, you do see something alarming, which is, back in the day, when people would say that the two parties are the same, they literally meant it. Like back in the 20th century, there was like jack shit difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party for much of that time. It was kind of a hodgepodge, a coalition of different interests. There were like New Deal Democrats, and then there were old Southern Democrats who had like nothing in common with them. But now, ever since the Reagan years, it's been getting a lot more polarized, and we're starting to see Republicans are hardcore conservatives, Democrats are hardcore liberals, and it just gets worse and worse with every election cycle. And now we're at the point where a lot of the Republicans seem to no longer even care about democracy or preserving the system that we have.
yeah,
It seems to just be all about Trump. Trump is their religion. Trump is their Jesus. They trust Trump. There's statistics on this. They trust Trump more than they trust their religious leaders. Like it's seriously a cult. And so we're at the point where it seems like our system is beginning to be at the point where it's going to be ebbed away. It's we're at the point where we have an erosion incoming, I think. And that's happened to a lot of republics before, but the United States has been so stable for so long that to a lot of us it just feels inconceivable that the system can erode. But I think it's very possible. And as far as a civil war goes, I don't really see that happening. What I think is more likely is that we're going to get a situation where the government becomes totally destabilized. It becomes a clusterfuck. There's no civility anymore. There's fist fights breaking out in the halls of Congress. Like that is where I see things heading, and perhaps some sort of an authoritarian takeover along the way.
yeah, well, I feel like if Trump actually does end up taking over, he tries to establish himself as like the indefinite leader of America. I feel like at that point, I'm not entirely as long as the military still falls in line with like the Constitution essentially, then I think we'll be fine. I don't know if Trump could actually manage to do something like that. But if he somehow manages to get the military on his side, then it's like game over. It's just done at that point. But I don't know if that's even really. I don't know if that's very likely. But
Yeah, I really loved having this conversation. Unfortunately,
yeah,
I'm going
yeah.
to have to
Okay.
cut it off right now because it's time for me to go to work. But
Okay,
I
sorry.
really like talking to you. It was a great time.
Yeah, no, it's
So,
interesting picking your
yeah,
brain.
have a good day.
Yeah, you too. See you later.
All right.
I'm sorry. I already hung up on you. Okay, well, that was you can't even see that. Okay, thank you everybody for watching. That was fucking Forever Dirt. Really interesting guy. I'm not sure how I feel about the fascism thing. I want to look more into fascism. Yeah, if I'm gonna talk to this guy again. But overall, that was an interesting conversation. I enjoyed it. But Anyways, thanks for watching, guys, and yeah, I love you.